After his defeat in 353 BC against the Phocian commander Onomarchus, Philip had returned to Pella to nurse his wounds and rebuild his army. The next year he marched his army south again to confront Onomarchus and the Phocian army, this time achieving a decisive victory at the Battle of Crocus Field. In the aftermath of the battle, Philip ordered that the 3,000 Phocian prisoners be drowned, a ritual punishment for grave robbers in response to the Phocians' sacrilege at Delphi and their acquisition of the tributes held within. In recognition of his contribution in the Third Sacred War, Philip was elected the president of the Thessalian League. As president, Philip had the entire Thessalian military at his disposal. Crucially, this included the elite Thessalian cavalry. These famed horsemen were considered the equal of Philip's own Macedonian companions, and would help win many battles for Philip against his Greek opponents, and later for Alexander against the Persians. In 349 BC, after a period of friction with Olynthus and the other city-states of the Chalcidice Peninsula, who had allied themselves with the Athenians, Philip decided to invade the entire peninsula. The support the Athenians promised to the people of Olynthus arrived too late, and in 348 BC, Philip's forces razed the city to the ground, selling the inhabitants into slavery. With the invasion of the Chalcidice Peninsula came the first signs that some in Athens were beginning to realise that the Macedonian king could potentially pose a threat to Athens itself. One of the most prominent opponents of Philip was statesman and orator Demosthenes, who delivered impassioned speeches to his fellow Athenians warning of the threat posed by Philip and the need for the Athenians to prepare for war. Most Athenians, however, refused to believe that these upstarts from the north could ever pose a serious risk to the might and power of Athens. A year later, in 347 BC, Philip was presented with an opportunity that would smash Athenian complacency once and for all. After the Battle of Crocus Field, the Phocians had managed to regroup and the conflict had continued. The weary Thebans sent emissaries to their Macedonian court, asking for Philip to ally his forces with them and to finally put an end to the long-running conflict. In the same year, after failing in their attempts to organise a coalition against the Macedonians, the Athenians had to accept reality and enter into peace negotiations with Philip. A year later, in 346 BC, they swallowed the bitter pill of signing a peace treaty with Philip that would be known as the Peace of Philocrates, recognising the Macedonian right to Amphipolis, the Chalcidice, and the Thessalian League. As a result of the peace treaty, when Philip responded to the Thebans' request for help and marched his army south to Thermopylae, the Athenians did not offer support to the Phocians, who were forced to capitulate. As a reward for ending the war, Philip received the 2 votes on the Amphictyonic Council that had previously been held by Phocia, and was granted a place of honour on the council, the most powerful political alliance in Greece. Almost immediately after the signing of the peace treaty between Athens and Macedon, there were powerful forces in Athens led by Demosthenes that opposed the peace with Macedon. Over the next few years, relationships remained strained, and a cold war existed between the two powers. Philip now set his ambition to extending his kingdom to the north and east. He led his army into Thrace, and by 342 BC had completed his conquest of Thrace, including the realm of the Athenian ally Cersobleptes. 2 years later, in 340 BC, Philip laid siege to the cities of Perinthus and Byzantium. Alarmed by the threat to the strategic city of Byzantium, the Athenians sent naval support, frustrating Philip's attempts to take the city and effectively putting an end to the peace treaty between Athens and Macedon. This proved to be the final straw for Philip, who had lost patience with the continued Athenian efforts to undermine his kingdom. Emboldened by his new strength and political influence, Philip decided to take the initiative and provoke the Athenians into conflict. His first move was to seize Athenian grain shipments at Hieron on its way from the Black Sea to Athens, thus depriving the Athenians of their most important food source. The following year, in 339 BC, Philip was presented with a perfect opportunity to march his forces into central Greece. The Locrians of Amphissa had committed sacrilege within the perimeter of Delphi by ploughing sacred land. Philip used his position as the leader of the Amphictyonic League to convince the League members to vote that he should lead a force to punish the Locrians. In the winter of 339 to 338 BC, Philip marched his army south and quickly crushed the Locrian resistance. He then marched his army east, occupying the town of Elatea, situated just 80 miles from Athens. As Philip had planned, such a provocation could not go without a response from Athens, who quickly formed an alliance with Thebes and mobilized a coalition army to face the Macedonian threat. In early August 338 BC, the two armies lined up for battle in a narrow valley near the village of Chaeronea. The opposing sides were evenly matched with roughly 30,000 troops on each side. Now 18 years of age, Philip's son Alexander was given the responsibility of commanding the left flank of the Macedonian troops. Facing him across the valley on the coalition army's right flank stood the Theban Sacred Band. These elite troops had been crucial to the Theban victory over the Spartans at the Battle of Leuctra 3 decades earlier that had ended the myth of Spartan invincibility in battle. The Sacred Band numbered just 300 troops and was made up exclusively of 150 pairs of male lovers. Philip knew that in order to win the battle, he would have to break the Sacred Band. The Macedonian army marched forward in formation to engage the coalition army. Before the two armies engaged in battle, Philip ordered his troops to halt. He then ordered the right wing of his army to move backwards while still maintaining their formation. On seeing the retreating troops, the Athenian generals believed the Macedonians were retreating and ordered their forces forward in pursuit. As the left side of the coalition forces moved forward, they shifted towards the left as they moved diagonally forward. This created a gap between the main body of the coalition army and the Theban Sacred Band, who held their position on the right flank. Into this gap moved Alexander at the head of the Macedonian infantry, followed by the cavalry, who encircled the Sacred Band. The members of the Sacred Band fought bravely, but were overwhelmed by the Macedonians and were slaughtered. On the Macedonian right side, Philip ordered his forces to halt their retreat and moved his army to encircle the Athenians. With the coalition army in disarray, the Macedonians were able to secure a famous victory over two of the most powerful states in ancient Greece. The site of the battle was marked by a statue of a giant lion. An archaeological excavation close to the ruined monument in the late 19th century discovered a gravesite that held the remains of 254 humans, lending support to the theory that the monument was erected by the Thebans to mark the fallen of the Sacred Band. After the rout of the Athenians and Thebans, Philip sent Alexander and the general and statesman Antipater to lead an embassy offering peace terms to the Athenian assembly. The Macedonians offered generous terms to the Athenians. In return for agreeing to form an alliance with Philip, the Macedonian king would return all Athenian prisoners captured at Chaeronea. The Athenians would retain control of their islands in the Aegean. Athens would not be garrisoned by Macedonian troops. Athenian property would be respected and its people unmolested. The Athenians readily accepted the terms and even conferred Philip and Alexander honorary citizenship of the city. Philip's generosity to the Athenians formed part of his strategic objective. At this point, Philip was already making plans for an expedition to liberate the Greek cities of Asia Minor. In this endeavour, the Athenian navy would be invaluable, and so it made more sense to have the Athenians on side than to have them as a resentful enemy. In contrast to Philip's generosity to the Athenians was his ruthlessness towards the Thebans. Philip regarded the Thebans as a potential threat to his control of central Greece. The Macedonian king replaced the Theban democracy with an oligarchy. Border areas that had been disputed with Athens were awarded to the Athenians, and Philip stationed a garrison in Thebes itself. This was all designed to prevent Thebes from ever again challenging Macedonian hegemony in central Greece. The winter of that same year, 338 BC, Philip called for a general assembly of all the Greek cities at Corinth. This was the same city that the Greek city-states had met at when they had agreed to unite to fight off the invasion of the Persian king Xerxes the Great. With the notable exception of the Spartans, most of the Greek states were in attendance to listen to the terms Philip delivered. These terms included the submission of the assembly members to the decisions of a central representative council, a mutual defence pact, and the formation of a unified military force under Macedonian leadership. Philip was to be declared the supreme commander of the League forces for life. With none of the attendees strong enough to dare to defy Philip, terms were agreed and would go on to be called the League of Corinth. Finally, Philip had achieved his ambition to become the most powerful figure of a unified Greece. With Greece won, Philip wasted no time in turning his attention overseas. His first decision as military leader of the League was to propose the invasion of the Persian Empire. Philip presented this endeavour as a crusade to obtain revenge on the hated Persians for their invasion of Greece almost a century and a half before, during which they sacked Athens twice, desecrating holy shrines and razing the city to the ground. Once again, the attending states had no choice but to support Philip's proposal. Philip set about making plans for the upcoming invasion. The Persians were facing a crisis of succession, as well as fatigue from years of suppressing rebellions in Egypt and other provinces. The time was right for a strong ruler to lead the Greeks across the Hellespont and drive the Persians out of the Greek-inhabited cities of Asia Minor. Returning to his capital at Pella, Philip declared that he was to divorce Alexander's mother, Olympias, on suspicion of adultery and marry a young maiden called Cleopatra, who was the niece of Attalus, one of Philip's leading generals. In turn, Attalus was the son-in-law of Parmenion, another of Philip's leading generals, and so a child born to Cleopatra would have ties to some of the most influential families at the court in Pella. Olympias had always been an outsider in the Macedonian court, and whilst Alexander was a fine young man, he was still not fully Macedonian. A fruitful union with a blue-blooded Macedonian bride would further strengthen the legitimacy of Philip's descendants to rule in the eyes of the Macedonian nobility. This caused a rift in the relationship between Philip and Alexander, who fled the kingdom. The union of Philip and Cleopatra did bear fruit the following year, but the child was not the son that Philip had hoped for. With plans progressing for the invasion of Persia, Philip followed the advice of friends to reinstate Alexander as his heir, to maintain continuity and secure his position on the throne during the years he would be away campaigning in Asia Minor. The king ordered that horse riders be sent out to the west to bring Alexander back to Pella. Philip's preparations for the invasion of Persia were nearing completion. In 336 BC, a Pathfinder force under the command of Philip's most trusted general, Parmenion, had crossed into Asia Minor and was preparing a bridgehead for the planned invasion force. After his reconciliation with Alexander, there was only one outstanding issue that Philip had to resolve before he could begin the invasion. The divorce of Philip and Olympias had soured relations with Alexander, the king of Epirus, who also happened to be the brother of Olympias. The scorned ex-wife of Philip had returned to her brother's court after fleeing Macedon, and had called for him to act to restore the family honour. In an attempt to heal the wound, Philip offered the hand of his own daughter Cleopatra in marriage to the king. Cleopatra was the daughter of Philip and Olympias, and so the full sister of Alexander, and niece of the king Alexander. By offering the hand of marriage of his own daughter, Philip was bestowing a great honour on Alexander, and he planned that the alliance would further bind the ties between the royal households. As Philip had calculated, Alexander agreed to the union, leaving Olympias further isolated, and with a much diminished influence in the Epirus royal court. Philip decided to celebrate the union in grand style, inviting dignitaries and ambassadors from all over Greece to Aegae, the original Macedonian capital, as well as its spiritual home and burial place of Macedonian kings. The festivities also provided the opportunity for a final reaffirmation of loyalty to Philip from the members of the League of Corinth before he set out on his expedition against the Persians. Sacrifices to the gods were planned, as well as the staging of athletic games. On the morning the games were due to commence, a large crowd had gathered on the hillside slopes of the theatre in anticipation of the day's events and the arrival of the king. When Philip finally made his appearance, he was flanked by his son Alexander and soon-to-be son-in-law Alexander, the king of Epirus. Earlier that morning, he had ordered his bodyguards to follow at a discreet distance, as a visible sign to the assembled Greek diplomats of his approachability and his closeness to his subjects on whose behalf he ruled. As Philip stood basking in the adulation of his subjects, who lined the hillsides, waving and shouting his name, one of his personal bodyguards was observing the king's every move, waiting for an opportunity to act. The name of this young man was Pausanias of Orestis, the son of a noble family that had entered the Macedonian court as a royal page, and had captured the attention of the king, becoming his lover. As time passed, Philip's affections turned elsewhere, and Pausanias fell into a well of jealousy and rage. This turned into hatred as he fell out of favour at court, and was publicly humiliated by Attalus, Philip's general, becoming an object of derision and contempt. As his thoughts turned to murder, Pausanias conspired with sympathetic friends to slay the king and make his escape. Seeing Philip unprotected, the would-be assassin realised that his opportunity had arrived. He stepped forward and approached the king. As he drew close, Pausanias suddenly pulled a dagger from beneath his cloak and plunged it directly through the king's ribs. Turning to flee, he sprinted out of the theatre, heading for the saddled horse waiting for him outside. He had almost reached his steed when his foot became entangled in a vine, and falling to the ground, he was quickly set upon by Philip's bodyguards, who ran him through with their spears. Back in the theatre, Philip had collapsed to the ground, his white robe stained crimson red from the blood flowing from the mortal wound he had received. He died where he lay. During his 23-year reign, Philip had transformed his country's fortunes, turning Macedon into the leading military and political power in Greece. Philip's kingdom would pass on to his son Alexander, who would fulfill his father's dream of leading a unified Greek force into Asia to take on the Persian Empire, and in doing so write his name in history as the greatest military commander of his age. If you have enjoyed this production, please consider supporting the channel by leaving a like and/or subscribing to the channel.